All right, so I think I'll start now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on a beautiful, beautiful Tuesday evening in Cambridge. My name is Esther Wagner. I am the Executive Director of the Wolf Institute. Thank you very much for coming again. I can see from the names that quite a few have been to our webinars before. The series is jointly run by the Wolf Institute and the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, with other partners, for example, the CSIC, IMF, the University of Munich, the Medieval Studies Research Group at the University of Lincoln, Leicester Medieval Research Center, and Ghent University. So many of you in the audience will be familiar with our format, but for those who are not, just first a quick introduction to the Wolf Institute. The Wolf Institute is a research institution in Cambridge. We focus on religion and society. We combine our research with teaching and public education and policy work. And please have a look at our website and our YouTube channel if you want to learn more about our work. And now with my hat on as Vice President of the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, the Society was founded in 1997 and is dedicated to all aspects of the academic study of cross-cultural Mediterranean history from the 5th to the 15th century. And this is a moment when I introduce our journal. This is the journal of the Society. It comes as part of the subscription for the membership of the Society. So consider joining our Society. If you haven't yet, you'll get this amazing journal that comes out 3 times a year. It's really, really worth the read. Now, a very quick introduction to how this webinar works. We have a Zoom webinar audience. We also have an audience via Facebook where we're live streaming. If you want to rewatch this or if you want to recommend it to anyone, you can watch that on Facebook, or you can also go to the Wolf Institute YouTube channel. I think very soon the video will be available there. So very excitingly, our topic for today is the Mediterranean diet, new perspectives on the foodways of the medieval Mediterranean. And I'm going to introduce now our formidable chair for today, Dr. Caroline Goodson from the University of Cambridge, who's the brains behind this webinar, and she will introduce the speakers and the intellectual thrust of the webinar in a second. The panelists will present and will have a short discussion among themselves as well, while you can prepare questions for the Q&A session we'll have after the presentations. So if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, because it's much, much easier for the chair to handle them through the Q&A portal. And now it is my absolute great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Caroline Goodson. Caroline, over to you.
Thank you very much. As all of us know, the Mediterranean is broadly consistent in that it is very variable. There are major changes from one region to another. There is a history of volatile weather patterns, and the territories around the Mediterranean basin have been under cultivation over millennia in order to try and sort of navigate this variability. So over millennia, consistent patterns of food crops, of animal husbandry, and by extension, ways of eating have emerged. Within this, there are some considerable variations. So grapevine works better in some places, olives in others. There are different grains that are suited to different parts of the Mediterranean, but there is a consistent package which emerges really from the Bronze Age, but certainly through the Hellenistic and in the Roman period. And indeed, during the Roman period, the Roman army, imperial administration, and state-supported trade expanded the areas that became familiar with this central package of Mediterranean products. So through the sort of wine grapes and the apples and the dill and the coriander that was characteristic of the Mediterranean diet became available and even cultivated in the Netherlands and in Britain. Whereas rice and pine nuts and other Mediterranean products were shipped. This familiar repertoire of foods and ways of eating, which was developed over centuries and amplified during the Roman period, persisted into the Middle Ages. But in response to key social and economic changes, strategies of cultivation and diet changed fundamentally. The fragmentation of the Roman Empire created a strongly regional economic and political context in the territories of the former Western Roman Empire and in the East. And the regular transport of products from the Mediterranean up into Central Europe through river networks ceased more or less by the 7th century. everything became increasingly local. The majority religion, Christianity, promoted distinctive patterns of consumption, like fasting around religious holidays or the ritual use of wine, and this reshaped cultivation. And then secondly, new political forces emerged from there, conquests in the Near East, the Middle East, and North Africa and Iberia. The rise of the First Islamic Empire of the Umayyads provided a political framework for new forms of trade and a hegemonic cultural context based around Islam, which had its own abstinence from certain foods and preference for others. Within the caliphate, new crops were cultivated in Mediterranean contexts, and these provided new products and new dishes. So these patterns are really familiar. We know a lot about them from texts. Texts provide normative instructions about what should be done, what shouldn't be done. Contracts can record crops, they can record prices and shipments. Recipe books and medical treatises tell us what was available or what ought to have been available and what wasn't. But the details of how these norms and these aspirations and these big, broad political patterns worked on the ground emerged from archaeology. The archaeology of plants, animals, and people. We can understand the plants and the animals which lived and were used by different societies of the Mediterranean, and analysis of human remains can cast light on individual and community dietary regimes. So we've got quite a lot of opportunity and emerging technologies which allow us to see individual choices around food for nutrition, around ritual, insights into daily life. The granular data which emerge from archaeological contexts can be agglomerated and can tell us about local patterns and even regional patterns, which allow us to see changes in practice, by which I mean the patterns of growing, of reaping, of fishing, of butchering, of disposing of food remains. These are things that are communicated by the doing rather than by textual norms. So archaeology really gives us some principal data into understanding how things worked on the ground, how daily life was affected by these broad concepts and ideas. Archaeological sciences give us really key insight into this small scale and big picture patterns. And new techniques are emerging to understand genetic changes of species which lived alongside humans in the past, to understand changes over the course of life, of the life course of individuals, and to think about the interactions between environmental change and socially driven changes. So today we've got a panel of 3 archaeologists who are going to share with us their research on this topic from 3 really distinct vantage points, different parts of the Mediterranean and different modes of archaeological research. We're going to start with Michelle Alexander, who is senior lecturer in bioarchaeology at York, where she works on the Mediterranean diet in the historic period with a particular interest in cross-confessional and cross-cultural contexts. She looks at Iberia, at Sicily, and elsewhere. Then we will hear from Tarek Oueslati, who is a chercheur with the French National Scientific Center, the CNRS, and he runs the bioarchaeology laboratory as part of the research team for the Histoire, Archéologie et Littérature des Mondes Anciens at the University of Lille. He works on excavated faunal remains, so animals from France, Spain, Italy, Greece, Morocco, and Tunisia. And then we'll hear from Daniel Fuks, who is a postdoctoral fellowship at the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research here at the University of Cambridge, where he's working on crop diffusion and agricultural change in late antiquity and the early Islamic period, developing fieldwork that he carried out in the Levant. So we're going to turn firstly to Michelle, if you'd like to share your slides.
Okay, hopefully you can see that now.
Super, yeah.
Great, perfect. Okay, thank you very, very much for having me and for allowing me to speak at this fantastic session with some other fantastic speakers, actually. So as you've heard already, I focus on the medieval Mediterranean, and I'm going to be talking about isotopic analysis today to explore diet in particular. Okay, so I'm particularly interested in the medieval Mediterranean because we have Christians, Muslims, and Jews living together in a shared landscape. And we have religion as a major component of identity, but we have the other ways in which identities are constructed through common ways of life, experiences, and material world. There will be a degree of identity that is shared no matter your faith. Obviously, lots of scholarship dedicated to exploring the dynamics of these multi-faith societies in the Mediterranean, and archaeology and scientific approaches have something to offer here, particularly when considering diet and economy. And I tend to focus on the West, as we have just heard. I'm not going to go into lots of this, but it is quite good to know some of the basics about what's going on with isotope analysis. So basically, the data I'm going to show today, this is bone collagen. So I extract the protein from human remains. That protein, bone collagen, reflects protein in the diet and gives you about an average of about 10 years of life or so, depending on what element you sample. It gets that dietary information down to the level of the individual, but you can also blow it up to population level. And this then gives us information on choice and access to foods. So there'll be a few graphs like this. This is just to give you a kind of an indication of a baseline plot. You've got nitrogen on the vertical axis, you've got carbon on the horizontal axis there. And depending on what you're eating, you plot in different areas. So carbon primarily shows you difference between C3 plants with lower values, C4 plants with higher values. And those C4 plants are important in the Mediterranean because we have things like millet, and in the later periods, sorghum, particularly after the Arab agricultural revolution, and sugarcane. So all of these come out quite distinctive in terms of their isotope data. And then they also, carbon can tell between a terrestrial and a marine ecosystem, again, terrestrial towards that left-hand side of the graph and marine towards the right with those higher carbon values. Nitrogen values change depending on where you are in the trophic ecosystem. So plants are at the bottom, herbivores will eat the plants, then you've got the omnivores that eat herbivores and plants, and you've got carnivores above those. And then if you've got aquatic ecosystems, they tend to have very high nitrogen values, and in particular you've got those marine ecosystems with both high carbon and nitrogen values you see on the top right hand side of the graph. If you're a human, you tend to plot around the kind of omnivore area, unless you are a vegan, in which case you will plot like a herbivore. If you eat cheese, it is animal protein, and therefore that's going to show up in your diet as you eating animal protein, so just like meat. So we also look at the animals when we do these kind of analyses, and this tells us about the baseline. So it tells us the isotopic values of the possible foods that people are eating, but can also tell us about economies themselves and what the animals are eating, and therefore what often humans were actually foddering their animals with. And the thing that I'm interested in the Mediterranean in particular, as I've mentioned a little bit about C4 crops, they're interesting also because quite a few of them in many cases are seen as a low status crop. So if you're eating millet and sorghum, they're seen as a bit of a low status thing to have to eat. If you're wealthy, then you want that those highly refined C3 kind of wheat crops, for example. So isotopes in the Mediterranean then, there's lots of people doing this now, it's all over the place. So this is an excerpt of all the published sites so far from the 2021 paper that's come out. And this just gives you an indication of how many of us are now working on this kind of area. But you can see one of the areas I'm going to talk about today is Sicily, and that at the moment, we don't have any published data for that. I'm going to focus on the West. But what's nice is because we have so many sites now, we're talking about these kind of population level, we can look at regional level trends in some of the isotope data that's coming out. And this is what I've got here, which is a bit of a quick and dirty plot using the Pandora and IsoMemo applications, which are available online. Ricardo Fernandez has been spearheading this particular data tool, which allows us to plot stable isotope data through space, which is what you've got here, geographical space. You can also do it through time. But this takes all the isotope data from 1,000 years, about 500 to 1500 CE. And you can see here, just from looking almost kind of heat maps, the kind of differences we see coming out already from this kind of regional perspectives. So in nitrogen, we can see high values, particularly around the Atlantic coast of Iberia, where we're going to get a lot of marine foods. Also, there's a nice hotspot in that northeast area of Spain, which is probably related to aridity in the Ebro Valley in particular. And if we go down to look at carbon across this area, we see again Iberia showing up quite distinctively with these enriched enrichment in carbon, which is indicating marine and C4 at the top here, marine down here, and also probably more C4 here coming out. So that's those sorghum and millet crops coming out there. Not so much C4 coming out elsewhere, apart from here in northern Italy. But this takes all the data from all time periods. And you know, obviously, there is a need to kind of disaggregate this and to think about the local. So this multiscalar approach that Stable Isotope offers is really interesting. And what I'm going to do is focus on a couple of little case studies from what I've been interested in. And these are these local stories. So this is research I did quite a long time ago now. One example is that of Valencia on that east coast of Spain. Obviously an affluent medieval port city. I was interested in having a look here at whether we can see differences in diet through different changes in political rule. So that social mediated change that might have come across in this period. And some of the number of burial populations across the city, including some high status Muslim individuals from La Lauda, where these individuals are buried in distinctive graves with some gold thread found. And also we have some grave markers there too, which indicates their high status. The data then, from here, the most important thing to look at are those blue dots. Those are the Muslims. They're all over the place, really diverse diets during the Muslim period. And what we're seeing here is we could have people come from elsewhere, but also this individual choice in diet. Those groupings that we see kind of up here and around here don't map onto, unfortunately, any status indicators. So there's wealthy individuals plot kind of all over the place around here. But we do see this variability coming out, particularly in the Islamic period. Most people plot in the similar kind of area, and that kind of looks like what is probably a local diet and the most common diet through time. If we plot the animals on with two, this is a slightly different way of looking at the data. The animals here in white, and then the humans are coloured by different colours depending on the period. We see that animal data shifts a bit with human data as well, which is indicating it's not just the humans deciding to eat, for example, C4 crops, which have these higher values in the Islamic period, but also the animals are showing this enrichment in carbon too, indicating we've got a definite use of C4 crops, both for animal fodder and for human consumption during that Islamic period, that we do not see in the later Christian period to the same extent. So you've definitely got some changes going on here with changes in political power. And this is going to be related to a change in livestock and agriculture management, particularly what came in with the Christian conquest, where we see an intensification and emphasis of agricultural products for market, which is quite a change from what we had in the previous Islamic period, where we have a lot of polyculture and a balance between herding and cereal farming, where you've got animals kept locally fed on C4 crops, particularly cattle and chickens. And millet and sorghum are known, particularly from Arab agronomy texts, to be good for fattening livestock. This is actually carried out still in the northwest of Spain until recently. Also, sorghum in particular may have been identified as a Muslim foodstuff. Porridge made with almond and sorghum is mentioned as a characteristically Muslim dish. And we have 17th century writings of sort of Aragonese priests saying that the iniquitous food ways of the Moriscos, including the consumption of millet and sorghum. So a little bit there also about cultural identity, particularly coming out maybe with diet. Another little example is that of Gandia, south of Valencia on that east coast of Spain. I was looking at Christians from the main settlement of Gandia itself, in that kind of urban settlement, and then Muslims from an Alhama, so a small community underneath the rule of the Duchy of Gandia of Mudajales or Moriscos, depending, this is a time period when they should have converted. So I was looking at these kind of Moriscos in comparison to those from Gandia. And what's interesting is at that particular site, sorry, of Gandia, we see that the funerary practice they use, even in this late period, follows that of the Islamic practice that would have been happening earlier. So we might have crypto Muslims here who might have been continuing with Muslim life ways, certainly with Muslim death ways, as it were, in this case. And data from these sites revealed some significant differences between Christians and Muslims living at the same time under Christian political rule. And we have an enrichment in both carbon and nitrogen seen in the Muslims in comparison to the Christians, which might be related to an increase in consumption of marine foods by the Muslims, which might seem odd because of Christian fasting and fish, but actually maybe there's been a restriction in butchery practice that they would want to adhere to at this time. But also we've got C4 crops being important to this particular community. We know that they're involved in sugarcane agriculture, and this comes out quite nicely potentially with the animal data, where we have cows in particular, two groups, one C3, one C4. So we've got a sugarcane economy at this site, which is coming out in the human data too, where they are eating probably C4 fed animals. So we might have grain as well. We've got chickens also with C4 here. Any kind of C4 crop that's not obviously looking at sugarcane is also seen obviously as low status. So if they are consuming things like millet and sorghum, potentially then we're seeing a decrease of that kind of interfaith relationships that we can see in this later period, and therefore the decreasing status of Muslims at the kind of twilight of their presence really on the Iberian Peninsula at the time. If you're interested, we're looking at similar things like this, looking at the landscapes of frontier castle sites and trying to understand the shifting frontiers and military conquests and their relationship with economy and subsistence in a project, an AHRC funded project with Reading and Granada. So keep an eye out. We're beginning to get some data for that now. The other one I just wanted to briefly mention is the work we'll be doing in Sicily in transition, big ERC project, the PI Martin Carver here at York, but working with the University of Rome Tor Vergata and Salento. And we were very interested here to understand the relationship of regime change in Sicily with diet and cuisine. A lot of the work on isotopes has been done actually by my PhD student, Alicia Ugi, and the dietary research for this project actually involved lipid residue analysis, isotopes, archaeobotany, zooarchaeology, dental calculus, a lot of stuff. So we're looking at the transition from Byzantine to Islamic to Norman to Swabian and trying to understand what we can see in terms of diet here. We have a nice kind of range of sites from across the island that we've looked at, and we've divided them into various areas, geographical areas. We've got West, Agrigento and East, and then Palermo as well. Here is an urban site, and this has got carbon on the left, nitrogen on the right. And what we can see is Agrigento stands out for having quite high carbon and nitrogen values, and that's probably a distinctive marine kind of economy that might be going on down on that south side of the south central side of the island there. Palermo has quite wide variations here, which might be related to the fact that it's a city, an urban city, and being provisioned from a wide area. And the East is distinctive for having very low nitrogen values, and looking at the animals, which aren't here, this is all human stuff. Actually, the animals look very low in nitrogen too. So we might be seeing more of an environmental difference across the island that's been reflected in these dietary isotopes, which is quite interesting. So there are some geographic patternings in diet. When we look through time, there is remarkable continuity, particularly when we thought about those examples from Valencia and Gandia there. So through time here, we're not seeing a big difference coming in with the Islamic period and the agricultural revolution. We're not seeing a massive influx of C4 crops coming out at all, which is kind of interesting really as we go through. But we do have maybe, again, this decrease in kind of variability in crop in carbon values, which might be related to this kind of marketization or an intensification economy like we were seeing in Valencia. Burial practice, so we've got that data I just shown was everything from everywhere. We don't see differences for males and females. Nothing that I've showed today I could say with certainty there's huge difference by gender. When we look at differences, potential differences by burial practice in Sicily, we need to try and look at the same kind of time period and the same kind of geographical area. And we're not seeing huge amounts of huge kind of differences here in terms of diet anyway, between Christians and Muslims buried at a similar kind of time period in a similar kind of area. So that's quite interesting. Not particularly separated in life, although in death, particularly the site of Segesta, we do have separation of the two burial sites, one Christian and one Muslim. C4 crops, they're not coming out in the Islamic period like Spain on a kind of unilateral thing, but we do have glimpses of C4 crops coming out in the diet. Potentially, we've got a lot of mobility during this period, so we might have people moving from areas such as North Africa, where we do have C4 crops, and that was another thing that could have been coming out for Valencia. But we do have individuals with micro debris, so trapped in their dental calculus, that show millet. So although we don't see it archaeobotanically, and it's not very strong isotopically, it is coming out in the dental calculus and potentially with a few animals. And we're going to explore this a little bit more with more sophisticated techniques. So we're going to look at the amino acids, individual amino acids in bone collagen to explore marine and seafood diets in some of these areas. So in summary then, what we can see is, although isotopic analysis from bone collagen provides a broad picture of diet, the results indicate considerable degree of individual choice or access into foodstuffs. These isotope data provide a useful complementary perspective, which encourages consideration of individual diets, but snapshots of populations and economies. Even now we can get to this kind of regional scale too. But we don't have coherent portraits of Christian and Muslim diets. Cultural and religious groups should not be envisaged as homogeneous or representing binary opposites. And we don't have any consistent differences in isotope signatures between faiths that could not be more plausibly explained by differences in social, economic status, or even dietary trends through time. So the archaeological evidence particularly underlines the importance of geographical, social and political circumstances as a determining factor in diet. And seafood crops and marine food in particular come out as having a significant role to play. And we have these patterns of exploitation of these particular crops and foodstuffs across the region and at a local scale and through time. So it's a very exciting area to work in. So I'd like to say thank you to all the people who've helped make all this research possible. I'm sure there's more here that I could name too. So thank you to everybody, and also thank you to you for listening.
That's great. Thank you so much, Michelle. There's quite a lot to think about there, and we'll fortunately have time for questions. I'm going to move quickly on to Tarek Oueslati. Thank you, Tarek. That looks great.
Yeah, so good evening, everybody. I'm Tarek Oueslati. I'm a zoark. So I use animal bones as a proxy to document the foodways on archaeological sites. The topic of tonight is on medieval sites in the Mediterranean, and therefore we think immediately about the Arab conquest and a particular taboo on the consumption of pig meat, of pork. We will of course, this is an important subject when we study the changes in medieval times across the Mediterranean, but changes must have been more complex, and we must have been having a change in the cuisine as a whole, which means includes recipes, the vessels in which the food was cooked, the ingredients, the spices. So this is can be only tackled through an interdisciplinary approach, with historians exploiting the recipe books, for instance, the ceramists studying the vessels, the pots, which are discovered on archaeological sites, and also zoarks and archaeobotanists, which will work on spices and different botanical ingredients. The choice of meat which is consumed is probably linked to cultural factors at the scale of the individual, the family, the area, or large geographic portions. The consumption of ovicaprids in the Mediterranean sphere is one example which may be cited. For this presentation, I will be using the data from 3 different sites with different phases of occupation in the medieval period. First, I will be presenting the site of Beirut with the Umayyad period, that's the 7th century. Then I will go on to Rira, which is a site in Morocco, with 2 medieval occupations, one from the 9th, 10th century, and the other one from the 12th, 14th century. And finally, I will end with Utica, which is in Tunisia, and we have a 10th, 12th century occupation there. These are the different institutions which excavated the 3 sites that I'll be dealing here, and where I studied the animal bones. So let's start with Beirut, with the Umayyad occupation. I will be showing you The advantage of archaeology is to be able to work on diachronic sequences. So that's going through different layers from different periods and investigating the foodways through time. So this is what I'll be showing you for each of these sites. So first of all, for Beirut, here we see the main components of the diet. As you can see, that we have a high proportion of ovicaprid along the sequence here, from the Hellenistic to the Umayyad period. And we see here, if we compare cattle and ovicaprids, we see that we have a mirror effect between the two curves, which means that the proportions of one species is linked to the other. Whereas for pig bones, we see that the frequency doesn't follow such a tendency, and we have stable proportions around 20% during antiquity, and a decline, then a disappearance of pig bones in the Umayyad period. So if we go from the Hellenistic occupation, if we use it as a reference and we follow the evolution of the proportions of the different species, we can see that pig reaches a maximum in the Roman period, which is a usual trend we see in most of the Roman Empire. Then we see that we have a decline in pig bones, which starts in the Byzantine period. One Byzantine site, 115. These are two different sites on the sequences, all from 002. That's the name of the site. And I added two Byzantine sites here to see that we have some diversity within Beirut. And we have an early decline of pig on these sites, and even a decline which is similar to the Umayyad period for 115. So I will give a hint why we might have this tendency here later on. Another change in the composition of the assemblages is linked to the proportion of veal in the assemblage. And we can see that through the occupation, and particularly in the Umayyad period, we reach a very high proportion of veal in comparison to adult cattle in the assemblages. So that seems to be choice. And in Bay 115, we see in the Byzantine period, we see that we have the same proportions as in Bay 002. And this is, I think that there is a problem probably of stratigraphy, or so the attribution of the faces on the site, because we've seen very low proportions of pig here, and very high proportions of veal. That's a real characteristic of the Umayyad period in Beirut. Among other changes we have observed is the proportion of sheep in comparison of goat. At the start of the occupation of the site 002, we see that we have one sheep remain for 5 goat remains, and this the proportion of sheep will increase through time with the maximum which is reached during the Umayyad period. So we have a preference for mutton in comparison of goat meat, which is expressed at its maximum in the Umayyad period. Another way of seeing the animal components of the diet, is to check on the diversity of animal taxa which are consumed. That includes birds, hunted or wild mammals, fish, etc. If we usually I plotted here the number of species which are present in our assemblage, and I compared it with the number of remains which have been identified. Usually the largest the assemblage, the highest the diversity. But you can see for the Umayyad period that we have a quite low diversity of species in comparison with other periods with smaller assemblages. So it seems to be probably a choice for the Umayyad period not to diversify as much as other periods, the meat diet. We can see here, for instance, the consumption of chicken, which is quite lower in the Umayyad period in comparison with the Roman period. So if we sum up the data for Umayyad Beirut, we see that we have a decline of pork consumption with a strict abstinence straight away. The pork pork consumption stops with the start of the Umayyad period. We also see an increase in ovicaprid consumption to partially compensate the decline of pig. And within ovicaprids, the clear preference for sheep in opposition to goat. We also see a marked change in the culling strategies of cattle with the consumption of veal, which is very important. It seems to be another economic adaptation, a change in the agricultural practices around Beirut, probably for feeding the city with meat which has been produced specifically, because usually cattle is culled a bit later and with the animals which are used for reproduction, dairy production, and mainly for work on fields. So here it seems to be we have a specific breeding strategies for meat. We also have a decline of diversity in the animal components of the diet. The next site I will be showing is Rira in Morocco, which have provided very large assemblages, including for the medieval period. If we see the change between here we have pre-Roman assemblages, Roman assemblages, and here we have the medieval assemblages, we see again a mirror effect between the proportions of cattle and ovicaprid in green. And whereas for pig, we have a specific trend and a decline, which is important only from the 12th, 14th century, where only residual bones are present in the archaeological structures of this period. These structures are dug into Roman layers. That's why we have a contamination with some pig bones, which are residual, and we can identify them easily by the state of preservation. So what we notice is that in the first medieval, the Almoravid period, we have a high proportion of pig which is still consumed on the site. This is a close-up on the changes in the two medieval phases from Rira, and we see the increase of cattle and ovicaprid and the marked decline of pig. We can see also in this table the high proportion of birds within the assemblages from Rira, and also a high proportion of chicken, but also diversity in birds. This diversity includes ostrich, white stork, great bustard, and these birds have been hunted and consumed. As you can see on these bones, the arrows pointing to butchering marks on the bones. We have quite a high concentration of big fish remains, freshwater remains, freshwater fish remains in the assemblages of the medieval period with the shad, eel, and barbel. Here I can give you a comparison with the composition of the mammals in Volubilis, which has been studied by Anthony King in 2015. Volubilis is about 40 kilometers away from Rira, and in the 8th century, we see that on this Idrisid capital, so that's an important administrative city for the Islamic period in the 8th century, we see that we have nearly complete disappearance of pig, whereas in Rira, 1 century later, we still have a great proportion of pig which is consumed. So that shows you the variability within a real small scale geographic area. Another site in Morocco, which is a site which has been created ex nihilo, is Iglis in the medieval period, and we see that we don't have a single bone from pig on the site, so that gives to another extent with the respect of the avoidance of pig. So in the site of Rira in Morocco, we see that we have the consumption of swine flesh in the 9th, 10th century and the Islamic period, and the abstinence starts only from the 12th, 14th century. And we also have a sustained diversity of birds and fish. Finally, for Utica, for the 10th, 12th century, we have is a trend, the evolution through time, and we can see that in the pre-Roman period there aren't many pig remains. We have an increase in the Roman period, which is again a characteristic of the Romanization of the diet. And when we get into the Islamic period, we see that we have a marked decline, complete disappearance of pig, except for a few residual bones. Again, the structures here are dug within the Roman forum, and therefore they're crossing Roman layers, and we might get some contamination with a few bones. What we see through the Islamic occupation is also a marked decrease in the diversity of the meat sources which are exploited. We see that there is a great decline in marine resources and also in fish, in chicken consumption. So to conclude, the impact of the Arab conquest on meat consumption from the three examples we have taken, we have an abstinence from swine flesh consumption, which may be immediate following the Arab conquest in Utica and Beirut. And may take centuries to be respected, and that is the case of Hira, which might hint towards a tolerance towards breeding and consuming of pigs. We also see that there is an economic strategy in the hinterland of Beirut with the breeding of veal. This is a significant change because the production of veal in Europe, for instance, only appears with such a high proportion in modern periods. So that's a big change in the 7th century for Beirut. We also see in Beirut a reorientation of ovicaprine herding with a clear preference for sheep after a more important exploitation of goat in the past. As far as the diversity of consumed animals is concerned, we see that in Beirut and Utica, there is a decrease in the diversity of species which are consumed, whereas a great diversity of hunted animals and fished resources is exploited on Hira. The hunting in Hira focuses on birds, and one might think about maybe the introduction of falconry and the use of raptors for catching birds. That might be an activity that could explain the high proportion and diversity of birds which are consumed on this site. Falconry is introduced since late antiquity in Northern Africa. So many thanks.
Thank you very much, Tarek. There's lots to think about there. That's great. I'd like to move swiftly on to our last speaker, Daniel, who will be speaking to us about Beyond the Mediterranean Triad, Agricultural Introduction and Intensification as seen from the late antique Negev highlands in Israel. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you to the organizers for having me on this webinar, Foodways of the Medieval Mediterranean. Looks okay, the presentation? Share?
Super. Yep.
Screen sharing, great. Okay, and thanks also for the opportunity to present my perspective as an archaeobotanist of the Southern Levant, with an interest in broader questions on agricultural economies, as well as their social and environmental contexts. When I say that I'm an archaeobotanist, I mean someone who studies past human-plant interaction through archaeological plant remains. Archaeobotanists have traditionally focused on prehistoric assemblages, particularly those relevant to identifying domestication and the origins of agriculture. This might be justified by the fact that in the Middle East and Mediterranean, food baskets have been highly stable since the domestication of the Neolithic founder crops some 10,000 years ago, including wheat, barley, and pulses, and the domestication of fruits such as grape, olive, date, and pomegranate by the early Bronze Age, no later than 5,000 years ago. From that time on, these species remained essential to local diets, especially the Mediterranean triad. The rest of agricultural history in the region may be seen as fine-tuning. But this later agricultural history was by no means uneventful. It involved imperial intrigue, technological innovation, and labor transformation, spiced with exotic seasonings and even agricultural revolutions. I'll offer one small window onto such processes, demonstrating archaeobotanical reconstruction of crop introduction and agricultural intensification with relevance to some of these wider historical questions. Here I draw on my PhD research on the plant remains from ancient rubbish heaps at 3 archaeological sites of the first millennium CE in Israel's Negev desert, Shivta, Nisana, and Elusa. The research was conducted in Ehud Weiss's archaeobotany lab at Bar-Ilan University, Israel, as part of the ERC project on the Byzantine Islamic transition in the Negev highlands, headed by Guy Bar-Oz at the University of Haifa. I like to frame this research, my archaeobotanical research in this project, as using a modified Brodelian model of agricultural and societal change at different scales. In the introduction to the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world in the age of Philip II, Fernand Braudel famously presented 3 timescales at which history transpires: the long run of environmental history, the medium term of social history, and the fleeting events of political history. For Braudel, this was a means to organize his masterpiece, reorient history writing to include a more balanced treatment of social and environmental processes, and ultimately influence a wide range of other fields in the humanities and social sciences. Perhaps also under the influence of Braudel, I identified 3 scales of time at which my data on late antique Negev highland plant remains inform on human history. Long-term millennial influence of agricultural innovation and crop diffusion, medium-term decadal centennial economic trends, and sub-annual seasonal rhythms of ancient agropastoral activity. In each case, there's evidence for movement of plants across geographic scales in sync with the temporal scales. And here, I'll address just the first two of these 3 temporal scales. So let's start with the millennial scale crop diffusion with reference to Andrew Watson's Islamic Green Revolution, or IGR thesis. The IGR thesis holds that a package of crops, along with requisite irrigation technologies, were introduced from mostly East and South Asia into Mediterranean lands circa 700 to 1100 CE. Critics counter that pre-Islamic crop diffusion was at least as significant, if not more. I first learned about Watson's thesis during my master's coursework under Zohar Amar at Bar-Ilan University. In his PhD and book, published in Hebrew, Amar synthesized the medieval references to agricultural crops in the southern Levant, or Bilad al-Sham. In a nutshell, Amar agreed with Watson regarding some of the proposed Islamic agricultural introductions, but not others, and he added several additional locally introduced crops not mentioned by Watson. Amar also argues for a medieval textile revolution, which saw the phasing out of linen, the rise of cotton, and the introduction of white mulberry trees for silk production, alongside indigo cultivation for dyeing. A partial English language summary may be found in Amar and Lev's recent book entitled Arabian Drugs in Medieval Mediterranean Medicine. My first publication engaging with the IGR was as co-author to this article in Antiquity, which summarizes Oria Amichai's work on plant remains from an Abbasid Jerusalem marketplace. Among almost 40 useful plant species identified were the earliest remains of aubergine in the Levant. Next, I led a method and theory paper in which I delineate criteria for identifying crop introductions in the archaeobotanical record and their relevance to agricultural innovation. I applied these criteria to the Abbasid Jerusalem marketplace assemblage, demonstrating why the aubergine may be reliably considered an early Islamic introduction. Finally, I used these criteria to analyze my own archaeobotanical assemblages from the Negev highland rubbish heaps, from which I identified 144 distinct plant taxa. Among these, 24 represent cultivated species, some of which are shown here, and this is what they would look like in color. Of the 24, one, the aubergine again, is an early Islamic introduction. These aubergine seeds represent a component part of the proposed Islamic Green Revolution, including the introduction of summer-growing crops. However, 7 species introduced during the first couple centuries BCE and CE appear to implicate Hellenistic and Roman crop diffusion as the greater force for intercontinental movement of crop plants. I label this phenomenon RAD, for Roman agricultural diffusion. Yet, all 7 RAD species, plus the IGR aubergines, are poorly represented in the Negev highland middens. The best represented cultivated plant species are members of the Mediterranean triad, particularly grapes and grains. This indicates that the long-term entrenchment of new crops in local diets proceeded gradually. Still, crop diffusion in the first millennium, Middle East and Mediterranean, appears to have had a greater impact than any period since the Neolithic. This insight is supported by a growing number of archaeobotanical studies from across this wider region, which colleagues and I plan to synthesize at a workshop to be held in Cambridge this May. Moving on to the Decadal Centennial scale, this study, published 2 years ago, charts agricultural intensification and abatement in the form of the rise and fall of Negev highland viticulture. I use changes in the relative proportion of grape pips and cereal grains as an index for the intensity of viticulture in each of the 3 sites over 5 chronological periods of late antiquity. The rationale for this is that in ancient Palestine, grapes were more likely to be a cash crop than cereals. Hence, changes in the frequencies of grapes relative to cereals indicate changes in the extent to which grapes were a cash crop. So if you were a local subsistence farmer with 30 dunams of land, say, you'd likely plant 20 with cereals with which to feed the family, 5 with vineyards so that you'd have what to drink, and on the remaining 5, you diversify with various other fruit and vegetable crops. But if you were to start selling wine as a cash crop, you'd gradually devote a relatively higher proportion of your plot to vines. This change would also express itself in agricultural waste, as a relatively higher proportion of grape pips in the rubbish heap. And that's just what we found based on 10,000 grape pips and cereal grains, a rise from negligible proportions in the 1st to 3rd centuries to a peak in the mid-6th century, followed by decline in the latter 6th and early 7th century. We also analyzed the relative proportion of Gaza jars thanks to Tali Eriksson Gini's tireless work identifying over 30,000 ceramic sherds. Gaza jars were used to transport wine and much better suited to camelback transport than the main other type, the bag-shaped jar. Amazingly, the very same trend was evident in the ceramics. The seed remains thus indicated a rise and fall of viticulture, while the ceramics suggested that this was connected to a rise and fall in Mediterranean trade. Thinking beyond the Negev highlands, the rise of this local industry is at least partly related to Roman Byzantine Palestine's comparative advantage in viticulture, which complemented Egypt's position as the empire's breadbasket and industrial olive oil production in Libya, Tunisia, and southern Spain. The decline of Negev highland viticulture preceded the Islamic conquest by a century. This indicates, once again, the inaccuracy of the well-known Piren thesis, which held that the Islamic conquests were the cause of decline in Mediterranean trade. Rather, the mid-6th century decline corresponds with a turbulent empire-wide period of pandemic in the form of Justinianic plague and climate change in the form of the late Antique Little Ice Age, followed by social-political turmoil associated with the end of the Justinianic age. Each of these could have acted as triggers, exposing the vulnerability of the peripheral Negev economy to contracting markets across the Mediterranean. The relevance of this insight for today was picked up by the media in the wake of the publication. Let me share a final insight, which I hope demonstrates how this multi-scalar approach adds depth and dimension to reconstructing ancient plant economy. First millennium crop diffusion affected local foodways and agricultural routines only slightly at the time, but in ultimately significant ways, including the adoption of summer cultivars in the Middle East and Mediterranean. Meanwhile, Byzantine agricultural intensification in the form of Negev highland viticulture was highly significant on the Centennial scale and made a lasting impression on the archaeological landscape, but its long-term economic impact was limited by a lack of resilience in the face of climate change, plague, and social-political instability. With that, I want to thank the funders and partners in this research, and to all of you for listening.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much for that. Now, we've heard 3 really different, really rich papers with lots and lots of different kinds of information. It would be wonderful if there are any questions, if people would like to put them in the Q&A. One of the things that I found most exciting about these papers is the way that there's such a strong correlation between economic change and what we can see in terms of food waste, food preparation, and agriculture. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Tarek, if I could, just about that in particular, is whether or not you are, and I'm sure you are making allowance for this because I know what your research interests are, but I want to talk a little bit about the ritual shift, particularly in the use of birds. So Elvira, you showed quite a lot of chickens from the Roman period. Are those butchered chicken bones, or are they chickens that have been raised and used for ritual purposes, and then in the 12th and the 14th century they're being raised for food?
We have no proof of the use of ritual use of chicken on the site, so it's probably they've been raised for the consumption, and we also have lots of egg fragments, so it's probably they also consume the eggs. So.
Great. Okay, that's really interesting. That's not my normal assumption about chickens in a Roman site. I think I learned that chickens in Roman contexts are usually there for eggs, yes, but also for ritual purposes or for gaming purposes.
Yeah, the Romanization generally on most sites in the empire leads to a very high consumption of birds. It's something really dramatic that changes and disappears as soon as the Roman Empire falls. So that there's a trend in consumption of oysters and mussels inland, and also consumption of the birds, domestic birds. But when we go to sanctuaries, Roman sanctuaries, we can find a lot of birds too, which are sacrificial birds too. So it depends on the sites on which we are, but if you are just on consumption on habitat sites, it's probably just linked to consumption, but doesn't mean that the animals weren't sacrificed in the house on the larère. So on the domestic altar, they could have been sacrificed, and probably they have been, because that's a Roman ritual before consumption.
Right. Great. Okay. Thank you very much. I wondered if I can ask you, Michelle, a question about your first example about Valencia, which struck me as extremely interesting in terms of the ways in which you can chart changed economic practices. And I wonder if you could just sort of take me through the sort of correlation between what you're seeing in terms of self-sufficiency, local scale economies, in terms of the carbon enrichment that you can see in the isotopes, and then the way that shifts to I guess a lower intensity, or am I getting that wrong, in the later period where you're hypothesizing there's greater market production of animals?
Yeah, so it's that. So the C4 crop thing is also related to potentially it being one of the preferred crops as well that might have been consumed by Islamic societies in that area. Interestingly, C4 crops, though, aren't consumed, as far as we can see, by Islamic populations in northeast Spain. So there is some quite different things going on geographically from that perspective. So that might be cultural affiliation, or it might be something to do with the environment of the site as well, which could be feeding into that. But it's just that diversity in values in particular that's kind of suggestive of polyculture and choice, and a garden, kind of almost garden economy in polyculture, versus what you have later, which is a much more restrictive range in isotopic values, both for carbon and nitrogen, in that Christian period. And it might also be to do with people coming from elsewhere as well in the earlier period, that we've got this shift in focus from different kind of geographical areas. So you've got North Africa being very close kind of culturally and politically during that Islamic period, and then the later Christian period, you've got a massive influx of people from the north moving south, and that we know that their economies in the north didn't really rely huge amounts on C4 crops, depending on where they came from as well. So it's quite complex on that, but it's that diversity which seems to really kind of typify the Islamic society's foodways in Valencia during Islamic rule.
Super, thank you for that. Now, I've got a number of questions that are coming up in the Q&A, but I'm aware that we're going to stop recording Facebook now. So I'd just like to thank everyone who's joined us on that format. And I will continue to take and field these questions if people are happy to carry on a bit longer. Michelle, there's a question for you here about the high fish consumption to the west of Barcelona. Diane Moneypenny was querying, she said she didn't catch the explanation given that it wasn't coastal.
So hang on, so that will be some of those regional perspectives that are coming out there, I suspect, in which case, and in the to the west of Barcelona, that it wasn't fish that's giving that kind of high nitrogen value there, it's environmental that's coming out there. So we've got quite a low carbon value in that area, but a very high nitrogen value. And so far, on the basis of the data we've got, it's looking like we know that the Ebro Valley is incredibly arid, and aridity at the plant baseline does have an effect on nitrogen values. So it's probably aridity there rather than marine foods. Those marine foods are definitely coming out on the northwest coast, but not in that area of the Ebro Valley where it's probably an environmental signature that's coming out through the plants themselves. So yeah, it's the complexity of interpreting the stable isotope analysis. It's not always straightforward, unfortunately.
Right. Okay, super. Thanks for that. There's another question in the Q&A here for Tarek, maybe a bit of a specialist question, but Tarek, to your knowledge, are there indications of horse meat consumption in Utica in late antiquity, or indeed elsewhere in North Africa? In research literature, it's sometimes suggested this comes up with the conquest of North Africa by the Vandals. Is that something you've seen?
We do have on certain sites the consumption of horses that appears in late antiquity, but I don't have specifically in mind from Rira, from the site of Utica. We don't have any consumption of horse. But I know that from other sites, we do see that there's a trend towards consumption of horse meat, but not in Northern Africa, but on Belo Claudia, which is a Roman site, which is on the Atlantic coast of Andalusia in Spain, on Andalusia. In the 6th, 7th century, we have horse consumption, which we didn't have before. So that's something which is very specific to the site. We have loads of late antiquity levels which have been excavated, and we have the earlier levels too. So we can see the evolution through time on the same excavation with the appearance of hypophagy in late antiquity as suggested by Daniel. So yeah.
Super, that's great, thank you. We've got another question here. This is also for you, Tarek, about Rira. Does the shift in what kind of meat is consumed correspond to changes in dishes and pots and vessels as well?
Unfortunately, I can't answer this question because the monography, there's been a whole set of books published on Rira from the first stages of excavation, but we never really did that interdisciplinary work I mentioned in my presentation, where we really have to sit down with the carpologists, the work, the pot specialists, and think about what happens, what changes. Do we have like whether the butchery techniques change because we have more pots for boiling meat, or so there's a lot that remains to be done. I'm really sorry not to be able to answer. I know that there are huge changes in the ceramics for the two medieval periods, but hopefully we'll be able to publish something soon on this subject.
But I mean, you're really making the case for the value of an integrated analysis, aren't you, in that? We've got one final question in the Q&A here from Leonor Peña Chocaro, who's asking, I think for Michelle, is that right? She says that archaeobotanical research is still quite limited in Iberia, but the evidence available does not show particular preferences for millet and sorghum, and sorghum, as far as she knows, hasn't been identified yet. So is it possible that animals are actually eating carbon-14 wild grasses, and that we're getting that signature in the bones, and later in those of the humans who are eating them?
So yes, it is possible for that. I kind of doubt it on this scale, because it's really intense. So yeah, we don't have great archaeobotanical remains to really underline this. There are some little patchy areas. So, in the area of Barcelona and things, I think we have found some millet in that location. I'm pretty sure there is some maybe in the north west in Galicia kind of area, but I don't think on this scale we could be seeing that. I don't think there'll be enough of those wild grasses to say that it's definitely that's going on, to be honest. Well, we know that sugarcane was definitely going on, for example, in Candia, but yeah, we just really want that archaeobotanical data to come out to see that. I mean, it's the preservation issues that we've got. You can see in Sicily, we don't have any at all there, and yet we still have some values that are quite enriched. That might be some wild grasses coming out, but yeah, I don't think on this scale it can be just a wild thing. I think it has to be a crop-based thing.
And with that, a plea for more archaeobotanical research in Iberia and really all over the Mediterranean. Okay, well, with that, I'd like to really thank our three speakers again. I have found that to be a really stimulating and exciting conversation. So thank you to all of you for sharing your research with us. Antonella.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you, Caroline, who's the mind behind this webinar that has been fantastic. And thanks once again to Michelle, Daniel, and Tarek. It's been fascinating. So this is a message just to also thank all our attendees, as always. Thank you for being with us. And a reminder that our next webinar is on the 15th of March. We're going to talk about slavery in the medieval Mediterranean with Hannah Barker, Cristina de la Puente, and Craig Perry. Also, we are going, as always, to send information via email and through the website. So watch out for it. There might be a slight change with the time, but we will notify everyone about that. So thanks again. Thank you to our speakers, and we hope to see you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.